Hey everyone, welcome to People Talk, the bi-weekly podcast where we talk to someone to figure out who they are, what they do, and how they see things. Folks, starting your own small business website can be a pain. Marty's here to help. At Kier Enterprises, Marty will put his years of experience and flexible pricing to work for you. Contact Marty at kierenterprises@gmail.com. That's K-I-E-R enterprises@gmail.com. And he'll get your small business website off the ground today. Now, this week's going to be a little bit of a different episode. Normally, we talk to someone to see who they are and how they see things. This week, though, we're going to be talking about a thing. 1 week ago, the 2016 presidential election ended, and I thought I'd bring in someone to talk about that thing. I'd like to welcome CU Professor Kenneth Bickers onto the podcast. Thanks for coming on.
It's good to be with you, Ryan.
Good. We were talking a little bit before I pushed the record button. You had a point you wanted to start with.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to reflect on what happened in this election and put it into some historical context. I mean, this is clearly a big election. Surprised a lot of people. Surprised me. I thought there was a chance that Trump would win, but I didn't think it was a big chance. I think I was with the conventional wisdom in assuming that Hillary Clinton would win. Certainly she was up in the polls. The polls over the last couple weeks going into Election Day had turned and Trump was becoming more competitive, but he hadn't broken past her numbers at that point. But I've been around long enough to know that momentum matters, that sometimes momentum can carry somebody through the weekend before Election Day, and sometimes they will win. We saw that, for example, in 1980 when Ronald Reagan surprised everybody and beat the incumbent Jimmy Carter. And the polls, like this time, showed Carter winning, and winning by a fairly comfortable margin. In fact, he was beaten pretty strongly by Ronald Reagan. What I didn't see happening was where Trump would break through states that Obama had won, that Romney had lost. And clearly he was going to have to do better than Romney's vote to win. So I was surprised. I knew there was a possibility that Trump would win because of the momentum, but it wasn't really what I expected. So with that as kind of a foundation, the question is why? What happened? And on that question, I've been giving really quite a lot of thought over the last week. So I thought maybe we could start with a discussion of what may have happened. And this is at least what I'm thinking at the moment based on what we know at this point in time.
That'd be good. Did you make a map of your own beforehand?
No, but I had a bunch of maps in front of me, and there were some maps where you could do different kind of scenarios that were available on the web, and so I had played around with some of those, and so I had, when I looked at the map, I thought, well, if Trump is going to win, and momentum is going to carry him past Hillary's numbers, he'd have to win Florida, he'd have to win Ohio, he'd have to win North Carolina. But it was beyond that I wasn't seeing where he would get to 270 electoral college votes. I didn't think that he would realistically be able to win Pennsylvania. I knew they were competing hard there, but Republicans have tried very hard for several election cycles to win Pennsylvania, and they have failed time and time again. And so I didn't see Pennsylvania coming, even though clearly they thought that they should be competing there. Michigan seemed possible to me, but Michigan, in the absence of Pennsylvania, it wasn't going to get him to 270. The state that I absolutely didn't see going his direction was Wisconsin. And when I was watching the results coming in, when Wisconsin when it was called for Trump as opposed to Clinton, who I had assumed would carry Wisconsin, that's when I knew that the election was done, that if he could win Wisconsin, he would certainly carry Michigan. Ohio had already been called for him. Indiana had already been called for him. But at that point, that was going to be enough electoral college votes because it also meant that he would probably carry Pennsylvania, and they were calling Pennsylvania. It was looking that way by that point in the evening. And so Wisconsin was the big surprise to me. And if you think about that group of Midwestern states, Republicans have been trying very hard in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Iowa to carry those states. But Democrats have been mostly winning have been entirely winning the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Iowa has gone back and forth a little bit, but has been more blue than red most of the time. Indiana is a pretty red state, even though it went for Obama narrowly in 2008. But it was moving past Clinton in Wisconsin, where I realized Trump has carried now enough in that group of battleground, very close, very competitive states that typically fall in the end for the Democrat, that he was going to win, and sure enough, that was the decisive moment, I think, in the evening for Trump. It took him longer to call Michigan, but he was ahead in Michigan, and he in the end really didn't need Michigan once he had Pennsylvania and Wisconsin.
I know. I was sitting there on election night with my map that I had made, and I had Clinton winning with 272. I had her barely win. So when I saw Florida go, I'm like, okay, Florida. I had going Trump. Pennsylvania, I had going Trump. But like you said, the Wisconsin, Michigan, those sort of states, I'm like, oh, that's weird historically.
Yes. Well, it was very interesting, very different. Now, I think part of what happened, and there's some irony in this, and other people have commented on this, so this is not new with me, but is that part of what happened in Wisconsin was the machine that was built in Wisconsin to keep Scott Walker from being recalled and then to get him reelected. That machine was very important, I think, in Wisconsin. The irony is that machine was largely built on the shoulders of two men, not just Scott Walker, but also Paul Ryan. And, of course, there was great tension between Ryan and Trump down the home stretch of the campaign, where Ryan was not campaigning with Trump. He was asking people to vote for Trump with all other Republicans that he was asking them to support. But it was not a Trump-centered appeal that Ryan was making. It was a Republican-centered appeal. And I think that was important in Wisconsin, and maybe why Wisconsin, they called it so much earlier than say Michigan, which was still very close. And some of the news sources didn't call it for several days after the election.
A lot of them still don't have Michigan called.
Yeah, it doesn't matter because Donald Trump is well over 270 at this point, so there's no question about that. So in thinking about that, I began to think about, well, what happened in this election cycle? And I think there are at least two parts to it, maybe some more, but two that really strike me as big. One is that this was another change election. And we've had in the last 6 election cycles 5 change elections where the public, in a variety of ways, was saying that they want to break with the status quo. And that was true this time, not just on the Republican side, but on the Democratic Party side. If you think of the remarkable campaign that Bernie Sanders was able to wage against Hillary Clinton, in the end, he was able to raise a lot of money in small amounts, but that was in the end, not at the beginning. At the beginning, he had virtually no money, and the money began to come in as the primary and caucus process unfolded. And he gave Hillary Clinton a run for her money. And I don't mean that just metaphorically. She had boatloads of money. She was very well funded. I mean, arguably, she had the most organized, best funded campaign of any non-president seeking re-election, maybe in American history. I can think of nobody in American history who has had the kind of campaign organization and resources that was not the sitting president running for re-election ever. So this was quite a remarkable feat. And Sanders, I think he scared him. how close he came, and not just in votes, but in enthusiasm, and in terms of the issues that were clearly animating the base of the Democratic Party. So you have on the left a Bernie Sanders challenge to the status quo, and on the right there were 17 announced candidates on the Republican side. 16 of them were squarely in the normal kind of resume of presidential candidates that we've seen in American history, and major party presidential nominees for the Republican or the Democratic Party. Any of the other 17, other than Donald Trump, fit a kind of normal pattern. So what is that? In all of American history, so this is kind of the historical context. In all of American history, we have elected until this last week, 5 presidents that did not previously hold high elective office. So 5 presidents who had not previously been a vice president, senator, member of the House of Representatives, or governor. Only 5. Of those 5, 4 had been generals that had played a decisive role in winning wars on behalf of the United States. So George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, Dwight Eisenhower, and often overlooked Zachary Taylor, old Rough and Ready, who was the hero of the Mexican-American War, which was a war that was highly controversial at the time. It was a war, it was not of necessity, it was a war of choice, and so forth. That's an interesting side note, that it was a war that we clearly created in order to have a war, but he was one of the heroes. That leaves a 5th. Who was that 5th? Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce, but he became Secretary of Commerce because during World War I, he was head of the relief agencies that kept Northern Europe from starving during World War I. He was widely credited as holding starvation at bay in the Low Countries during World War I, when food supplies were scarce because of the diversion of people away from farming and the disruption of agriculture, and a disruption of shipping because of the blockades that were being used to keep armaments from getting to the Central Powers. So that's it. We've had 5 in all of American history. On the stages of the debates, including the stage here in Boulder, when the Republican field came here for that debate, there was only one candidate on that stage that didn't fit that profile of holding of people that had held high elective office or significant executive experience, or both, executive in the government, and that was Donald Trump. So here's the next part of the historical. In all of American history, there has only been one person ever that was the nominee of one of the major political parties that came from the business sector, that didn't fit that profile of high elective military or high executive office in the government. Most people won't remember who that was, but it was Wendell Willkie back in 1940. That's it. If in the great sweep of American history, with major parties that date back to the early stages of our political history, there has been exactly one instance of a major national party nominating somebody like Donald Trump. So this is a remarkable thing to have 17 choices and a major party selecting somebody who clearly was as out of the establishment, as much of a break with the status quo as Donald Trump with. So what happened? This was the 5th out of the last 6 elections, with 2012 being the only exception, where the American public was saying, we want a change. We want a move from the status quo. In 2006, it was a Democratic wave. In 2008, it was the election of Barack Obama. In 2010, it was the Tea Party election of scores of Republicans to the House and the Senate. The Republicans took the House. They didn't quite take the Senate. 2012 was the one status quo election in the group when Obama was running for re-election. And then you get to 2014, and the Republicans, surprising many people, extended their gains from 2010 and did that not just at the national level, but way down ballot, so that the Republican Party was sweeping out Democrats in state governors' houses and state legislatures across many parts of the country. So then we get to 2016. The American public is still saying we want to change. And they've demonstrated on the Democratic side in the nomination process and the Republican side in their nomination process. And I think that the Democrats nominating Hillary Clinton, who could not be more status quo. I mean, you could not write a resume for a person and make them more status quo than Hillary Clinton. She eked out a slight margin in the popular vote, but not in enough states, and particularly the battleground states, where you had people who were really, really unhappy with the status quo. I think the choice of the Democrats nominating her handicapped them in this election cycle. So I think that's one of the big factors. There's a second factor, so that's on the Democratic Party side. They chose a representative of what the public for 5 of the last 6 election cycles has been saying we're tired of. We want to change. On the Republican side, Donald Trump, who is a terribly flawed messenger, had a message that was all about change. He has disavowed the foreign policy approach of the Republican Party of a generation, arguably for multiple generations, criticized a war that it was, to the extent that it was approved and viewed as something that the country should have done. It was approved of by Republican voters. He disavowed that.
The Iraq War.
The Iraq War, yes, exactly. He's used rhetoric and policies that are at odds with much of the Republican establishment, particularly on trade. A Republican Party that since the early 1950s has been squarely in the free trade globalist kind of side of the debate between free trade and protection. And he disavowed that. And then he used language that would be absolutely disqualifying for any Republican candidate that one could imagine over the last 40 or 50 years, or perhaps longer. Just unimaginable, that the kind of language that he used. And yet, for all of those things, he was tapping into discontents with the status quo and where America is, particularly for the people in those Midwestern states and some of the southern states where people feel like they've been left behind by globalism, by open trade, by NAFTA, a kind of open borders for trade in North America. In his crudeness, which he talked about as being that he wasn't a politically correct person, I think we can all stipulate that. I think there was something more fundamentally important about that, and much more fundamentally important about it. I think his rejection of political correctness was tapping into a sense that many of these people have, that Washington has been condescending to them, that that their concerns are not legitimate concerns, that if they were opposed to the direction of policy coming from Washington, of the dictates on everything from who can use what bathrooms to what kind of energy sources they can have for their cars and their other kinds of things that they want to drive, that those concerns are illegitimate and are just a vehicle for racism, a kind of surrogate for racism. And I think that he was tapping into this sense that people in flyover country have, that the elites in Washington and New York and California sneer at them, that there's this kind of preening self-righteousness that disregards what they view as legitimate concerns about the kind of lives that they want and the hopes that they have for themselves and for their children and so forth. And I think that showed up in I think his rejection of political correctness, and the more the media and elites piled on that the things he said were crude and inappropriate and so forth, I think it worked in a weird way to his advantage, that he was with them. That when people condescended to him, it's hard to condescend to a multi-billionaire, but nonetheless, when people condescended to him, that he was on their side because they had felt that kind of condescension. That the humor coming from the late night shows that made fun of people who didn't understand why boys go to the boys' bathroom and girls go to the girls' bathroom, and that somehow makes sense. That kind of concern is illegitimate, and it's not just something that we can have a conversation about, but is beyond the pale, is a sign of sexism or racism or homophobia or whatever. I think it played into this aggrievement that is not very far below the surface in a lot of the small towns in the part of the country that has suffered the most from open trade and from the decline in real wages over the last, not just this administration, but over the last couple of administrations. So I think those are the two factors that I see kind of coming together. One on the Democratic side of the choice to nominate the ultimate status quo candidate, and on the Republican side, a candidate that was able to tap into this kind of seething sense of aggrievement that they have been the ones that have suffered. So this is, I think, the concern is that there are people out there that have felt aggrieved and have felt condescended to, and I think Trump was able to tie into those concerns. So I think that's the second big factor is this Trump understanding this, and maybe it's all those years doing reality TV and the kinds of people that respond to reality TV and watch it and that they would be getting information about and so forth. Or maybe it's just political instincts for that moment in time, where those were the right instincts at that moment that allowed him to be the messenger for those concerns. And again, I'll say I think he was a deeply flawed messenger in many respects, but the message I think was a genuine one for millions and millions of voters, particularly in this group of states where Democrats historically have been in the majority, but where that majority has been slipping and where it was possible to punch through the so-called blue wall, the set of states that Democrats take for granted.
I have two things on that. One, you say his message, and when I think back on the election, I can't really put a pin into what Hillary's message was. I'm with her isn't really a thing that people can grab onto outside of the historic, event of a woman president.
My sense is that she had two or three key things, but they're not really compelling messages. One is the historic nature of the first woman winning. And I think she was counting on that as being a bigger factor for women voters than it turned out to be. I think it is important for a particular kind of demographic of women, a subset of women that are of a certain age and political disposition. The problem she had is a lot of those women are Democratic voters to begin with. So it doesn't add, it reinforces. So if you look at the exit polls, she did carry women by about 12 percentage points, but that was entirely on the back of minority women. It turns out she lost white women by 10 percentage points. Trump won 53 to 43% of white women. So while she carried a majority of women, it was entirely the product of the Obama coalition hanging together, at least in part, of minorities, some women, particularly college-educated women, but primarily single women, and younger voters, and she did carry younger voters, although again, that's carried by minority young voters. Trump carried a majority thinly. If I recall correctly, it was 4 percentage points. It could give or take one point, but my recollection is 4 percentage points. He carried white voters under the age of 30. She did not. So one message was, I'm with her, the gender issue. A second message, I think, was that she would maintain the gains of the Obama program. So very much a status quo message that if you liked Obama, you'll like me. And so it really was a kind of third term promise that she was making. And I think there was only one other piece to her whole message, which is that Donald Trump is unthinkable as president. And the problem, I think, was that she had so much baggage that for some voters, she was unthinkable as president. I mean, she had the highest disapproval rating of any major party nominee since polls have been taken, with only one exception, and that was Donald Trump. His were higher. But hers were higher than any others up to this point in time. And so once he became thinkable for some voters, and I think the email scandal, the home server, and the Benghazi, the killing of the 4 Americans in Benghazi on her watch as Secretary of State, I think those really hurt her. And I think in retrospect, I think a lot of the analyses will point to those as being factors that undermined the view that she had to be elected president. I think it created an opening for Donald Trump to get a look by people to ask, is he thinkable as president? Turns out that for people who put the job description as the most important thing, she won that vote handily. He did not. So the irony is that he was able to win a lot of people who really didn't think he was as well suited to be president. And I think it's because what trumped that, pun really wasn't intended, was the sense that the country needed a change, and that he had tapped into what that change needed to be. And so I think, of course, it was a very close election, and it could have gone either way, but that message resonated in just the right combination of states so that he could pull off an electoral college victory.
And I think the second part of what you said earlier that I kind of want to elaborate on, what I've been telling people, they say, how did he win, how all this, and I keep saying his biggest skill during the primary on through is he knows how to read a room. He knows exactly what a room wants to hear. And we kind of see that since he's become president-elect. We've seen his tone change because I think now he's reading a new room.
I think that's an interesting observation. I think you're probably onto something there. His tone since he won the election, and it was a pivot that happened in the middle of the night when he gave his acceptance speech, he has been much more gracious. He's been more accommodating. He's been placating people's fears. He's been acting presidential, which is, I think there were a lot of skeptics out there who couldn't imagine Donald Trump being presidential. And so we will see. I mean, we've had exactly 1 week of him as president-elect, and the presidency is 4 years long. So each term. So we will see how it unfolds over time. But I think that's quite right. The room he's now reading is a bigger room where he's supposed to be in charge of the whole room. It's going to be. I don't think we can take any day for granted. I think we're gonna. There's gonna be a lot to watch over the next few years.
And I do think it's interesting. And again, we're recording this on the 15th, so it's literally been 1 week. But he's already walked back a lot of stuff he was saying he wanted to do.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, actually, if for people who are reading the statements, the written kind of policy proposals, some of the things that the media is saying has walked back is because they weren't paying attention. They were so focused on the horse race or whatever that they weren't paying much attention. For example, on the healthcare reforms, the Obamacare reforms, he has maintained for quite some time that the parts that would stay in place are the pre-existing conditions and allowing young adults to stay on their parents' health insurance. That was reported in the news this week after the 60 Minutes interview as being a walking back. It's not a walking back. He said exactly the same thing all along. Another one has to do with his the wall, the immigration policy. He continues to say that there will be a wall. There may actually be some kind of a wall that gets built. We'll see. I don't know. Congress actually passed a law several years ago to build the wall. They just never got around to appropriating the money to do that. So there actually is legislation that they could build on that would allow them to build the wall. The part that has been reported as a walking back is that he is only planning now to deport the serious offenders. His speech in Las Vegas, when he laid out his immigration plan, that's exactly what he said at the time, was that they would start with that, with the deportation of the serious offenders, and then there would be a process or a conversation, I forget what noun was used, to determine what to do about the balance of the folks. That appears to be pretty much what he is saying right now, which is that they're going to start with the serious offenders. That actually is something where there is more bipartisan support. It's certainly not unanimous, but there'd be more bipartisan support for the deportation of people that have committed serious crimes in the United States. And I don't mean just coming here illegally initially or overstaying a visa, but having committed a crime after arriving in the United States.
So maybe it's not a true walk back, but at least the reporting makes it look so.
Yeah, I think the reporting is putting it in the frame of a walk back. And I think part of that is because the reporters, frankly, weren't paying any attention to the substantive policy positions of Donald Trump. They were caught up in the circus of Trump being Trump and so forth. And there's another reason, which is that he always in the campaign would lead with the bold, blustery, kind of bombastic statement of the policy. And then later on, there'd be all the footnotes and asterisks and qualifications and conditions that would just kind of be at the very end that wouldn't get the headlines. But what he is saying so far, the only thing where I've seen a genuine walkback is the non-prosecution of Hillary Clinton, and which I think would have been a mistake to do. I don't think we want to. I mean, this is my opinion now. I don't think we should be treating our political foes, the opposition, as criminals. I think American politics has gotten too rancid already. I think the criminalization of opposition is a mistake. Whether she committed crimes or not in terms of the email server or the Clinton Foundation and so forth, I just think it's a mistake to pound on the opposition after you've won an election. That really is the kind of thing that happens in banana republics and authoritarian regimes. I don't think it's healthy for a country where democracy is already, I think, way too polarized, and where there's way too much vitriol and lack of basic decency, of good faith, from one side to the other. And I'm not casting stones here. I think both sides are guilty. People might differ on who's more guilty, but I think both sides are guilty.
A big story that's been out since the election is the Electoral College, of course. Trump won the Electoral College, Clinton won the popular vote. This is, I believe, the fifth time we've seen this in American politics, twice in the last 5 elections. What's your take on that?
Well, it certainly can happen. And it's one of those things that when I started off in this career, which is about 30 years ago, I used to teach that while it was theoretically possible, it virtually never happens, and it's not something we need to worry about. And it turns out it is something we need to worry about. It's happened not just this time, but it happened in 2000 as well. I'm less bothered by it than some other people. And partly, to me, I think there are virtues of the Electoral College that are worth reminding ourselves of. But the other is that it's one of those things that can happen given the rules of the game, and the game is structured in terms of winning states with sufficiently large populations that you can win an Electoral College majority. So one of the ways that I teach this is to try to get students to think about other kinds of tournaments, which is basically what the Electoral College is. It's a tournament that happens simultaneously where there are 51 contests, but the contests are weighted unequally. That's what the game is. And so it doesn't particularly bother people that if you think about the NCAA basketball championship, that the 2 teams at the end, that one of those teams will win and one team will lose, but it's pretty common where the losing team in that NCAA championship scored more points over the course of the tournament than the team that actually won the tournament, that it scored fewer points overall. It doesn't bother people because they understand that the way you get to the championship is you win more games, not that you've scored more points. You have to score more points in each individual game. But 1 or 2 big blowouts early on in the tournament when you're playing little tiny schools that can barely field a whole basketball team, you can run up the score in 1 or 2 of those early games and end up in the championship, but not win the championship, even though you scored more points than the other team. That seems okay to people. That doesn't bother anybody, right? So if you think about this election, and I get it, the one person, one vote, I understand that this is viewed as kind of a deviation from democracy, but democracies all use different rules. They use rules for how we aggregate preferences, for how we count. So in this case, it appears that most, if not all, of the popular vote majority that Clinton got is attributable to her very large majority in California, that one state alone. Well, given the rules of the game, the 2 candidates were competing in these battleground states over a very small number of votes, 5,000 votes, 10,000 votes, 20,000 votes, 70,000 votes, because that's the rule of the game. If they're not putting resources into those states to get those few votes that'll put them over the edge in those states, they're going to lose the game even if they can run up the score in some other states. So Mr. Trump campaigned not one bit in California. Hillary didn't campaign much in California, but it's an overwhelmingly blue state. And the next contest on the ballot below the presidency was a Senate contest that was very closely contested. 2 very good candidates on the Democratic side, but they were both Democrats. Because of the change in the primary rules used in California, it's an all-comers primary, and the top 2 vote getters in that state, regardless of party, face off in the general election. So that featured an African-American woman and a Latina, both Democrats. So Democratic turnout was pretty high in California because there was there was a closely contested race that mattered to a lot of the voters in California. So Clinton got the benefit of this competitive race. If you were a Republican in California, and of course that's a minority, but if you were a Republican, you really had very little reason to go vote unless maybe a congressional race, if you were one of the few districts in the state with Republican members, or it was a contested Republican race where there were two Republicans running against each other. There were a few of those. Or maybe some way down ballot issues that you cared about. But otherwise, there was no reason for a Republican to show up in California and bother to vote. If we changed the rules so that it was a popular vote outcome, that we would also change the strategies of the candidates. And so to me, that's one of the more important things for people to recognize in this. We could do that. I mean, it would be very hard to change the Constitution to do it, but we could do it. But then you would not have the candidates throwing all of their final day resources, time, money, effort, into very close states. They would be campaigning where there are big untapped voter populations. Both Trump and Clinton would have been competing in California. Trump presumably would have lost California, but it would be irrelevant. What he'd be trying to do is get as many Republican votes there as possible. And Clinton would be winning California and trying to run up the score in California. And they'd be doing it on the West Coast, on the East Coast. They'd be competing in Texas where there are lots of votes. I mean, they basically would shift the campaign away from battleground states that are smaller or mid-sized to very high population states. That's okay, but that when you change that rule, you also change the strategies. So the fact that she won the popular vote is kind of okay. That happens, but that's not a function of a campaign strategy. That's a function of where the excess votes are likely to pile up. So that's one argument about it. But the virtue, I think, of the Electoral College is, let's think about it for a moment. If this is a change election, Bernie Sanders was saying many of the he didn't say the same things, but he was tapping into many of the same types of concerns about trade and about the cost of trade and who's affected. If global trade, free trade is a net positive. Net positive means you have positives minus losses, negatives. By focusing the campaign on those states where the issues really divided people closely, I think we had a better sense of what the animating issues are in an impacted part of the country. And so the Electoral College, for all of its flaws, one of its virtues is that it forces candidates to play the game in individual states, where the voters can express what's important to them in those states. The set of states that are the battleground states change all the time. In fact, the recent roughly 12 to 16 year period has been the longest period of little change in the battleground states that we've ever had, ever in American history, ever. The set of battleground states typically changes with quite a bit of change over every 2 to 3 election cycles, so that the set of the highly contested states at this point in time is considerably different than 4 years ago, and especially different from 8 years ago and 12 years before that. So to me, one of the virtues of the Electoral College is that it forces the campaigns to figure out what states are close enough that they really need to go and learn about what's most important to the voters in those states and try to fashion a message and a set of policies that can win over majorities in those states. I like that. I think that that's better than the kind of air wars strategy that we would have if we were doing a popular vote approach that just treated everybody as where their location isn't an important part of their their life story about what's important to them. And sure, it can have this effect. And again, it's had this effect. I used to say it's theoretically possible, but it just doesn't happen, and so let's not worry about it. And now I have to talk about it because it clearly is possible, and it's clearly possible because we're such a closely divided country that when you're closely divided, you can get this kind of thing where we fall a little bit to one side in the Electoral College, but a little bit to the other side in the popular vote.
The only vague solution, I guess, I've thought of, and I'm sure it's not an original idea on my part, but in my head, a good split between a purely popular vote in the Electoral College is we split the states up by congressional districts. And if you say a state has 10 Electoral College votes, and 6 of the districts in the state vote Republican, 4 go blue, well, the Republican then gets 6 of the votes, and the Democrat then gets 4 of the votes. I don't know what the logistical problems
You could do that. That would basically be the same strategy as a pure popular vote strategy, because congressional districts are essentially the same size, and so you'd basically end up with a popular vote. So if you're going to do that, you might as well just make it a popular vote rule. Yeah. I don't see many advantages of that over just, and particularly because congressional district boundaries change every 10 years due to the reapportionment redistricting process. The founders treated states as important units with different histories, cultures, economies, and so forth. And so the framing of the Constitution preserved important elements for states as states. In terms of the ratification of the Constitution, the most obvious, of course, is the Senate as an institution. I mean, if we want to talk about unfairness, there's, I think, a much more compelling argument for unfairness. I wouldn't go there, but let's lay it out. I mean, the correlation between population and Electoral College votes is a pretty good correlation. What's not a good correlation is the weighting of people to the votes in the U.S. Senate. In the U.S. Senate, California has 2 senators. It's got, 35 million people, or, I mean, your listeners will correct that, but tens of millions. And then you've got Wyoming, which has, 300,000 antelope and a dozen people? I mean, it's a small state. It's got the same number of senators. I'm being facetious, obviously. It's got several 100,000. It's like 300,000 or 400,000 people.
It's just under 500,000,
something like that. But the point is that California represents many, many, many times Wyoming, but they have the same number of Electoral College. Of votes in the U.S. Senate. Some people think that that's wrong, that the Senate should be apportioned in much the same way, that we should abolish a Senate based on states and go to a more pure population mechanism for that. I frankly think if you're trying to make a one person, one vote argument, it's a far more compelling argument to make in the case of the U.S. Senate than in the Electoral College. But people, I think, can and should differ. I mean, actually, the fact that people are having this discussion, I think, is healthy, because it causes both the defenders of the Electoral College and the people that are opposed to it to give principled arguments for why we should keep it or why we should change it.
All right, and one last thing before we finish up, predictions. Obviously, we don't know exactly how Trump is going to govern during the first 2 years of his presidency, but based on kind of what the feeling is now and what you know about what's coming up in 2018, what do you think 2018 looks like?
Well, I don't know. I mean, at this point, it's all pure speculation. If we looked at history as a guide, the Democrats should pick up some seats. So the Democrats have been decimated politically down ballot. I mean, as you go to the states, the Democratic Party you'd have to go back nearly 100 years to find a point in time where they are weaker as a party, or conversely, the Republicans are stronger as a party in terms of governorships, state legislatures, unified control of the state, elected offices. 1928 is the most recent year for the kind of Republican strength we've seen, but there are some dimensions of Republican strength that you'd have to go before 1928. So the Democrats are really in bad shape down ballot, and I think losing the White House is going to start a process of rethinking, which I think is a healthy thing for any party to do, and clearly the Democrats need to do that desperately. The best thing that they've got going for them right now is that they'll be able to be in the opposition. So opposition, to the extent there is opposition to the Trump agenda, and I suspect there will be a fair amount to certain elements of it, they'll be able to capitalize on that. So the history is that the out party picks up seats in the first midterm of a new president. That the high watermark for the president's party is usually the election that brought the president into office, because these things are correlated with one another. The reasons that people selected Trump and the reasons that they supported people down ballot for Senate, House, and so forth, those are often linked. So that, I'm not talking now just about Trump, but just over time that's been the case. So the first midterm election is the first delinkage of those ties, and is the first opportunity for people to register their discontents, to the extent they have them, with the incumbent party. So my guess is that the Democrats will they'll pick up some House seats. They are defending a lot of Senate seats in 2018. They'll be defending 25 Senate seats. The Republicans will be defending only 8 Senate seats. So this is tough for the Democrats to pick up many seats on the Senate side, and you'd have to say that they're going to be scrambling to defend that many seats. Historically, they do okay picking up some seats, but given that overhang, I think it's going to be tougher in the Senate for the Democrats. I think there are a lot of seats that they can pick back up in the House, but we'll see. I mean, if Trump is popular at that point, if his agenda seems to be working, if the country is growing, the Republicans will probably do pretty well. If the opposite is happening, if his popularity is low, if there's opposition to his agenda, if the economy is not growing, then I think it'll spell very bad news for the Republicans and very good news for the Democrats.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on.
It's been good.
All right. That was Kenneth Bickers. In 2 weeks, I'll have a more normal episode again. I've got a few ideas on who I want to have on. We'll talk to them again about who they are, how they got there, and how they see things. I've been your host, Ryan Burmester. Thank you for listening.